Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I'm going to have to do a video on the topic of history, or rather a topic on the BBC's depiction of history. Now for those of you who are not aware, on June the 30th of this year, the BBC uploaded a video titled The Black Heroes Whitewashed from Your History Books, Alt History BBC. And as you can tell from the like to dislike ratio, this video isn't exactly going all that well with the general public, which is actually quite understandable when you realize that it is exactly the sort of woke propaganda that you've come to expect being pushed by the BBC. Now, while I am of course going to be providing a link in the description below to the video so you can watch it yourself, I'm not actually going to be going over it point by point, as not only will that make the video drag on a bit, but also a fellow YouTuber by the name of Voltaire's Ghost actually did an excellent job of that himself anyways, so instead I will be leaving a link to his video as well. But to provide you a brief summary of what the BBC argues here, they not only incorrectly claim that modern historians deliberately downplay the contributions of minority troops during the First World War, to the extreme extent that they make it seem as if people don't realize that non-whites actually even participated in the conflict, but they even take it a step further by not only deliberately and hypocritically misrepresenting historical facts, but also omitting other details that really would provide a much more clear picture. In fact, and as Voltaire's Ghost mentions, this particular video is so bad that it's helped convince him to even sue the BBC over it. But anyways, allow me to provide a few examples of how we are not writing minorities out of the history of World War I. Now, to the video's credit, it does actually get one thing right, although it does highly misrepresent. That being that certain troops, such as soldiers from British India, for example, were held in extremely high regard, which is why most people who study World War I will in fact hear about their contributions during the war. What the video does not bring up, however, is the fact that this particular high regard was not exclusive to just white soldiers or British Indian soldiers. For example, when it comes to the contributions of the United States during the war, the most famous regiment without any doubt was the Harlem Hellfighters. Now granted, the officers of the United States weren't exactly enthusiastic about the potential of the Harlem Hellfighters at first, which is why they assigned them under French command. However, not only did the French welcome these troops with open arms, but they had nothing but good things to say about them during the duration of the war. So while it is true that American officers didn't at the time hold them in high regard, it's also completely true that these days the Harlem Hellfighters are seen as an indispensable part of American history when it comes to World War I. And while on the topic of troops that were held within high regards by the French, we also have to of course bring up the Senegalese, who gained such a fierce reputation during the war that the French actively used them as assault troops. In other words, you could actually argue that the Senegalese were the French answer to the British Commonwealth's Canadians. And they weren't even the only troops from French Africa that were held in high regard either, as I also have to now bring up the Zouaves from French North Africa, who in their particular case had a notable reputation long before the war even broke out, to the extent that as far back as the mid-19th century, a number of Europeans as well as North Americans actually formed their own Zouave formations, using not only similar uniforms and equipment, but even the same tactics and drill as well. In fact, the most famous examples of these LARPers being used in battle was during the American Civil War, in which both sides were fielding formations that were essentially trying to emulate North African troops. So to suggest that the Zouaves weren't actually seen as fearsome soldiers in their own right is simply untrue. And also on that subject, I of course have to bring up the German Askari, and how their campaigns and successes in German East Africa have been especially celebrated, to the point of being outright legendary. And while a good deal of that credit does go to their commanding officer, Colonel Paul-Emile von Lettow-Vorbeck, the simple reality is that he especially held these soldiers within high regards, to the extent that one can certainly argue that they've become a celebrated part of Germany's participation in the war. So to suggest that black soldiers, or soldiers from Africa, were written out of the history of World War I is simply untrue. Now I could go on about this, but I'm sure you already get the point, and that one point alone is enough to completely debunk the claims made by the BBC in their video. So instead, let's actually move on to a few specific things that the video says that irks me, things that Voltaire's Ghost hasn't addressed in his video. For a start, let's look at how they frame how history is depicted and taught when it comes to World War I and World War II.
The people I always saw when we were talking about World War I or II were always just strangely very happy European people at the army front, looking like they're having a great time winning the war.
Okay, so they actually try to argue that modern history portrays World War I and World War II as men at the front having a great time winning the war. I have to ask, is there any person here watching this video right now who, when they learned about the World Wars, thought, these people are clearly having a great time at the war? Just look at how happy they are. I mean, if you look in particular at how World War I is depicted, it's depicted in an extremely negative, extremely tragic, and extremely bloody light. In fact, even on the subject of World War II, the first thing you'll hear about it always is about just how destructive and deadly a war it was. And quite rightly so, given the sheer body count that it produced. So the fact that this particular person's image of both of the wars is men at the front having a good time really does show just how little research they've actually done on the topic. That is not just a bad take, that is legitimately insulting the intelligence of the audience. And on the topic of bad takes, there's another detail that I need to bring up that they've omitted, which actually has to do with the victory parades that were held in July of 1919. And that being that these particular victory parades were being held right after the third major outbreak of the Spanish flu, which had only died down in June of 1919. And keep in mind there would actually be a fourth outbreak of it in 1920, so it hadn't exactly fallen off the face of the earth. The reason I bring this up is that the same sort of people that are complaining about the victory parades, who by the way, and as Voltaire's ghost points out, misrepresented facts in order to push their claim, these same people would be absolutely horrified at the thought of trying to hold similar parades now. So basically what I'm saying is the fact that these victory parades were even held is a great example of just how men were made of sterner stuff back then. And to be honest, it's another great example of why that particular generation deserves our respect. Which is why it's all that much worse when the BBC is actively trying to convert history into propaganda. Now I should bring up that I will be keeping tabs on that aforementioned lawsuit that Voltaire's ghost has planned against the BBC, and I do plan on keeping you all up to date on this as well. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.